So in this video, I'm finally going to be gluing up these French doors. At this point, they're dry fit together. You can see I have all of my pieces laid out. This is the second door I'm doing, so I kind of tweaked my process for this, and I have everything ready for glue. The glue I'm using on this is going to be epoxy. I'm doing that for two reasons. Number one, there's a lot of pieces to get together. This is a slow set epoxy, so it takes quite a while for it to start to harden, which means I have a lot of time. My open window for doing all this is going to be longer than some traditional wood glues. The other reason is, like I said, I consulted a couple professionals in the form of books. They do this for a living, and one of them had specifically said that Titebond 3, which is the glue I usually use in the shop, when it gets too hot, the glue joints can actually delaminate. Now, this is not going to get a lot of sun exposure, but I don't think it's worth the risk, so I went with epoxy, which is something I usually don't use in the shop. But you can see I'm basically I put together the muttons first, I clamped the where the intersection is, then I could come in and just apply a lot of material on those mortise and tenons, get everything aligned and clamped. I have some denatured alcohol on the side, which works really well to clean up that epoxy overflow, because if you let too much of it set up on there, especially where there's molding and detailing, it can be a pain to remove. And then that's what everything looks like finally clamped together. Now, this is the second door I did. It's really hard to get these things aligned with all of those clamps. Usually I measure diagonals, but I was clamping as I went. This door, and I will mention this throughout the rest of the video, actually glued up about a little less than a 1/16 of an inch out of square. I ended up making it work, but that is something to note. And then I could just kind of place them in the frame. I was happy so far with how these turned out. Now, if you haven't watched the whole series, I specifically made these to fit just about perfectly in the frame, so I wouldn't have a lot of material to remove. And that's because I don't have a track saw, which makes that process really easy and quick. So that I don't necessarily recommend that if you're a novice woodworker or doing something like this for the first time, because there's not a lot of room for error. If you don't make your doors perfectly square and fit well, they might be undersized, which would be a fairly large problem. I just lightly sanded this stuff. There were some cracks in this stuff. There were some cracks in the wood that I filled with some epoxy. That one crack is facing inside the house, so I didn't worry about doing a butterfly or anything like that. If it does start to open, which I don't think it will, it's a somewhat of a small crack, I could always add one. So then I went through and, like I said, if you're watching this series, you kind of know the decision-making process on this, and I went through and I cleaned up my corners. The reason I have to do this is because I don't have a shaper, and I don't have fancier door-making bits, which make this process done in one seamless fashion. So when I did all of my stiles and all of my bottom kicks and top rails and bottom kicks for this, I couldn't make my profiles all the way to the edge. So what I did was I left them proud a little bit, and then I could come through with the router now that this is glued and clean those up. So obviously I was using a longer rabbiting bit on the back side, and then on the top side I'm using the profiling bit, and then I could just kind of weave those two details together, and that's how I got my corners. So it is a doable process. It's obviously going to be faster in a bigger shop with nicer tools, but there's usually a way in woodworking to do stuff with minimal tools. It's just usually more of a time commitment. So you could see what I was talking about this one door being a little uneven, and like I said, it ended up being slight enough that it didn't become an issue. So the next step was putting the hinges on the jambs and putting the hinges on the doors. I actually made an entire separate video for this because it is quite an involved process. So I'm going to go through it very quickly in this video. I basically just made a 20-minute jig in order to align all of my measurements and all of my depths perfectly on both my jambs and both my doors. Everything turned out how I was hoping it would. I will put a link to that video in the description if you want to watch it, because like I said, that was enough of a process to make a video in and of itself, but this is just a quick overview of how that jig looks, and setting everything up and making those very shallow mortises for those hinges is basically what you're doing. And like I said, on this process, it's not just important that the hinges mortise looks nice, it's really important that these are aligned door to door and jam to jam. Otherwise, getting these things to fit is going to be a pain. These are going to be ball bearing hinges. They're a little bit of a cheaper version of it, but so far I like how they work. I've been using them quite a bit. I take these doors in and out at the jam multiple times, and I'm actually still in the process of finishing these doors, so far they have held up. But that is basically what that looks like, and then I could kind of get them tacked back into place. So for now, I'm working on the floor because it's a little bit easier than working vertically, especially I've actually had this topple over on me once later in the process, because once those doors are opened, obviously if you're not paying attention, all of that weight is cheated forward, and there's really nothing holding up the jam at this point. So also at this point, I'm finally gluing together my jam with my threshold. I kept this stuff unglued because, like I said, I did have a little bit of leeway in the measurements for this jam, and I wanted to make sure the doors would fit perfectly in it after glue up before I committed to gluing this together, because technically with my process I could make changes to the size of this. So same process I just went through with epoxy. I had it clamped together, I just detached the top and bottom, added epoxy, and clamped it back together. Now since this is only glued at the corners, it will still wiggle around on me. That really won't be super sturdy until I have it actually in the frame. So as you can see, I have nearly a perfect fit of these doors in there, so I'm not going to have a lot of material to remove. Basically what I did was in the corners, I'm putting an 1/8 inch reveal on the top and bottom, and about a 3/16 inch of a reveal in the middle. The hinges are going to give me my reveal on the edges. So on the top and bottom, I measured down 1/8 of an inch. I drew a chalk line, and then I went through with a level and drew a straight pencil line. I did that at the top and the bottom. The reason I did it this way is because, like I said, this isn't attached in place yet, and since it's quite a wide piece, my top jam and my bottom threshold bow out a little bit in the center. So if you're measuring from the center, it won't be totally accurate. Once it's in place and I screw those, it'll be more square, but for the time being, I stuck to measuring close to my corners, which is going to be my more accurate measurement. Once I had that straight line on my doors, I just used a piece of plywood that is obviously straight. I went through and I cut it on the table saw so that edge is straight. I could clamp it right on top of my line, and I'm going to use a flush cut bit on my router to clean all these edges up. Like I said, in my shop I don't have a track saw. This is a little bit of a longer process obviously, but it worked really well. So this is the bit I'm using. It's about 1 inch. I think this is 1 inch Freud flush cut trim bit. So I'm gonna have to do this in multiple passes. These doors are about 1 3/4 inches thick, so you're not gonna go through this in one pass even if you had a fairly big door. So I just did about 2 with the plywood in place, and then once you get towards the bottom, you already have a guide that's the same as the plywood, so I could remove the plywood and the bearing will ride along the part that's already been trimmed, and I could finish that up. So you can see it is a series of multiple passes. Removing that plywood, like I said, that bearing will now ride along the cleaned up edge, and I could finish that up. Now I'm going to do this on the bottom and tops of all 4 doors because all of them needed to be trimmed. I'm not going to show you each one. The process is identical for all of those. But you can see the bottom, I took quite a bit off. This top one, there's not nearly as much material to take off, and that's why this process works so nicely, because everything's not going to be uniform, and this is the door that's a little off square, which is why it looks a little more off uniform. You can see how nice those reveals are. I'm pointing out that part that bows out a little bit on the top, which is why it doesn't look perfectly even. Same thing with the bottom bows out in the middle, probably because I've been having this set on my concrete for so long. The concrete likes to pull moisture out of everything, so I think that's why the bottom especially has been bowing a little bit more. And then same thing, so this is doing the other side of the door, just going through the process really quickly, sped up about 4 times the speed, so you can see it's just a couple passes and then everything's nice and clean. I also chamfered the edges of my doors a little bit before I did this so it doesn't tear out the edge of those stiles. So then for the middle, this fits in there if you kind of squeeze them together, but naturally the one door laid on top of the other. So all I did was I laid the one door on top of the other. The door I'm pointing out now is going to be the passive door, so that one will be fixed in place. And all I did was I marked where the doors hit, and then I added about 1/8 of an inch to it. Now since this is the uneven door, this you could see there's more on the bottom to remove than the top. So I decided to do that one, and I was planning on doing this exact same process to the other door, but once I set them in place, my reveal was just about perfect. Not only was it consistent from the top to the bottom, but it was the exact thickness I wanted, so I only did this on one door. And it was the exact same process. I put a piece of plywood on top there. I had to clamp it in the center because it's such a long run and work around that. But once I had the 2 passes, I could just clean the whole piece up. And then, like I said, closing the doors, you could see essentially the reveals. Now the center reveal is going to look a little bit thicker. It's just about where I want it, with a little bit of an emphasis on it being wider than I need it to be, and that's because I'm still building these. It's only just starting to get warm in my shop, and in my climate, cold usually means less humidity. Summertime means more humidity, so if anything, these doors are going to expand. So I wanted that gap to be a hair bigger than it needs to be. And that is basically what those look like. There's still quite a bit to go on with this process. There's a lot of hardware to deal with, the glass to deal with, and still some woodworking.